I bought a $19 million beachfront mansion. When my daughter-in-law found out, she called me. We want the house ready. I'm bringing my family and friends to stay for 2 weeks. I just smiled and hung up. When they arrived, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The phone rang at exactly 9:30 in the morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee on the terrace of my new oceanfront mansion. I knew it was Madison before I even looked at the caller ID. She had this particular timing, always calling when she needed something, never when she might actually want to check on her mother-in-law. Ellen. Her voice came through crisp and commanding, no greeting, no pleasantries. I just heard about your new house purchase. $19 million? Really? I set my coffee cup down carefully on the wrought iron table, watching the waves crash against the private beach below. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before me, a view I had dreamed of for 47 years of marriage to a man who never thought I deserved such luxuries. Good morning, Madison, I said evenly. How did you find out? She laughed, that sharp sound I had grown to despise over the past 15 years since David married her. David mentioned it. Though honestly, Ellen, I'm shocked you didn't consult us first. A purchase that significant should have been discussed with family. Family. The word tasted bitter when it came from her lips. Madison had never once treated me like family. Not during the holidays when she seated me at the children's table, while her parents got the places of honor. Not when she planned David's birthday parties and forgot to invite me until the last minute, claiming it slipped her mind. Not during my own birthday 3 years ago when she canceled our dinner plans because her yoga instructor had an opening. I didn't realize I needed permission to spend my own money, I replied, keeping my voice light despite the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Well, that's actually why I'm calling, Madison continued, her tone shifting into what I recognized as her planning mode. Brandon has spring break next week, and Ashley's been asking about a beach vacation. Since you have this enormous place now, we figured it would be perfect. We're planning to bring the whole family, my parents, my sister and her kids, maybe some of David's colleagues. 2 weeks should be enough time to really enjoy the property. The audacity took my breath away for a moment. Not a request. Not even a suggestion. An announcement. She was informing me that she would be taking over my home, my sanctuary, my reward for decades of building something in secret, while everyone assumed I was just Herbert's quiet little wife. Madison, I began, but she cut me off. Oh, and Ellen? We'll need the house prepared properly. Fresh linens in all the bedrooms, the kitchen fully stocked. You know what the kids like. And please make sure the pool is heated. Ashley is very particular about water temperature. We'll arrive Friday evening, so everything should be ready by then. My hand tightened around the phone. This was so typical of Madison. She had done this before, of course, but with smaller things. My Christmas dinner became her Christmas dinner, with me relegated to kitchen duty while she played hostess. My anniversary celebration with Herbert became about David's promotion at work. Every gathering somehow became Madison's show, with me cast as the supporting staff. But this felt different. This house represented something Madison couldn't understand, something she had no right to claim or command. And Ellen. Madison's voice carried that syrupy tone she used when she thought she was being generous. Don't worry about staying somewhere else. I'm sure you can find a nice hotel nearby. Or maybe visit that sister of yours in Phoenix. 2 weeks would be a lovely visit for you both. The memory hit me suddenly, sharp and clear. Last Christmas, when Madison had announced that they would be spending the holiday with her family instead. Ellen will understand, she had told David right in front of me. She's always been so accommodating. Besides, she doesn't really do much for Christmas anyway. I had spent that Christmas alone, heating up a frozen dinner while looking at photos of my son and grandchildren celebrating without me on Madison's social media. Or the time 2 summers ago when David graduated with his MBA. I had offered to host a celebration dinner, had even bought his favorite wine and planned his favorite meal. Madison had called the night before to cancel. We decided to do something more intimate, she said. Just immediate family. But her Instagram showed 23 people at a restaurant I couldn't afford, celebrating my son's achievement while I sat home with a table set for guests who never came. The pattern was always the same. Madison would take what she wanted, exclude me from what mattered, and somehow make it seem like it was my choice. Like I was the one being difficult if I objected. Like I should be grateful for whatever scraps of involvement she allowed me to have. So that's settled then, Madison continued, clearly interpreting my silence as agreement. Oh, and one more thing. Brandon wants to bring a few friends from school. College boys, you know how they are. So we might need extra security or something. Anyway, I have to run. Yoga class in 20 minutes. Thanks for being so understanding about this, Ellen. You're such a gem. I stared at the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone. She had hung up. Just like that. No goodbye, no thank you, no consideration for whether I might have plans of my own. I walked back inside the house, my footsteps echoing in the vast foyer with its crystal chandelier and marble floors. This place was mine. Every square foot of it bought with money I had earned, invested, and grown over decades while living in Herbert's shadow. While Madison and David and everyone else saw me as just another aging widow living off her late husband's pension. They had no idea. I moved through the house slowly, running my fingers along the custom woodwork, admiring the art I had finally been able to collect, the furniture I had chosen without asking anyone's opinion. For the first time in my 77 years, every decision about my living space had been mine alone. And now Madison wanted to take it. Not borrow it, not share it. Take it. Turn it into her personal resort while I disappeared into the background like I always had. I stood in the master bedroom, looking out at the ocean view that had convinced me to buy this particular property. The realtor had warned me it was expensive, even by California standards. Are you sure about the price point, Mrs. Whitmore? She had asked gently. Perhaps we could look at some smaller properties inland? If only she knew. If only any of them knew. I walked to my closet and pushed aside the hanging clothes, revealing a small safe built into the wall. Inside, among other important documents, was a leather portfolio I hadn't opened in years. My business records, financial statements, investment summaries, the paper trail of a fortune built slowly, carefully, secretly, while everyone assumed I spent my days playing bridge and tending to Herbert's needs. The truth was so much more complicated than they could imagine. And now Madison's arrogance had finally pushed me too far. I closed the safe and walked back to the terrace, picking up my coffee cup. It had gone cold, but I sipped it anyway, thinking. Planning. Madison had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I would react the way I always had before, with quiet acceptance, maybe some hurt feelings that I would swallow down and never mention. She expected me to pack my bags and meekly vacate my own home because she had decided she wanted it for 2 weeks. But this time was different. This house represented something she couldn't understand, couldn't take, couldn't diminish with her casual cruelty. This time I was going to let her come. I was going to let her bring her whole entitled family and all their expectations, and then I was going to show them exactly who Ellen Whitmore really was. I spent the rest of that morning walking through the empty rooms of my mansion, remembering how it all began. The weight of my secret felt lighter somehow, now that I had decided to finally use it. 49 years ago, I was 28 years old and pregnant with David. Herbert worked as a mid-level accountant at a manufacturing company, and we lived in a small apartment that smelt perpetually of the Chinese restaurant downstairs. Money was tight, but we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. Herbert had very definite ideas about wives and their roles. I was to keep house, raise children, and never burden him with financial worries. That's man's work, Ellen. He would say whenever I asked about our budget or suggested I might get a job. Your job is to make a home. But late at night, after Herbert fell asleep watching television, I would sit at our tiny kitchen table with the newspaper spread out in front of me. Not reading the recipes or household tips he assumed interested me. I was studying the business section, the stock listings, the financial news. My father had been an investor before the war changed everything. He died when I was 16, but not before teaching me to read market trends, understand company reports, and most importantly, think long-term. Money isn't about today, Ellen, he used to say. It's about 20 years from now, when today's small decisions become tomorrow's big results. When David was 6 months old, I took $200 from our grocery budget. Not all at once, $5 here, $10 there. Money Herbert never noticed was missing because he never paid attention to household expenses. I bought my first stock shares in a small company that made medical equipment. The kind of unglamorous business that steady, practical investors overlooked while chasing flashier opportunities. That investment became $400 within a year. Then $800. I reinvested everything, always choosing solid, boring companies that made products people would always need. Utilities, food processing, basic manufacturing. I told Herbert I had started doing bookkeeping for some neighbors to earn extra money. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did balance Mrs. Patterson's checkbook once a month. But the real money came from my growing portfolio, managed through a broker I met by claiming to be handling my late father's small estate. Herbert never questioned the occasional extra money. He assumed my bookkeeping paid better than it did, and he was too proud to ask for details about women's work anyway. When I suggested we might be able to afford a larger apartment, he took credit for his raises at work. When I mentioned we could start saving for David's college fund, he assumed his careful budgeting had freed up the money. The years passed. Herbert's salary grew slowly but steadily, and my investments grew much faster. I learned to be patient, to reinvest profits, to diversify carefully. I studied companies the way other women studied recipes, tracking their growth, their leadership changes, their market potential. By the time David graduated high school, my secret portfolio was worth more than Herbert made in 3 years. When David got married, it was worth more than Herbert had made in his entire career. And when Herbert died 5 years ago, the life insurance policy everyone expected to sustain his poor widow was just a tiny fraction of what I actually owned. But I never told anyone. Not even David. Especially not David. Because somewhere along the way I had realized something painful about my son. He had inherited more than his father's eyes and stubborn chin. He had inherited Herbert's assumptions about women, about money, about who deserved respect and who deserved to be managed. I saw it in how he talked to his secretaries at work, dismissive and impatient. I saw it in how he handled his own family's finances, making all the decisions while Madison played the role of decorative wife. And most painfully, I saw it in how he talked to me. David loved me, I knew that. But he had never seen me as anything more than his aging mother who needed looking after. When Herbert died, David immediately assumed I would need help managing my finances, understanding legal documents, making important decisions. "Don't worry, Mom," he had said at the funeral, patting my shoulder like I was a child. "Madison and I will make sure you're taken care of. Dad left enough to keep you comfortable, and we'll help with anything complicated." I had smiled and nodded and let him believe it. Let him think his mother was just another helpless widow, who would gratefully accept whatever guidance her grown son could spare time to give her. It was easier that way. Easier than explaining that I had been managing complicated financial decisions for decades, while his father thought I was just balancing the grocery budget. Easier than watching David struggle to reconcile his assumptions about his simple, domestic mother with the reality of a woman who had quietly built a fortune through her own intelligence and patience. And much easier than dealing with Madison's reaction to learning her mother-in-law wasn't the poor relation she had always assumed. But Madison's behavior had grown worse over the years. The casual dismissals became deliberate exclusions. The thoughtless comments became calculated slights. She treated me like hired help at family gatherings, like an inconvenient obligation she had inherited by marrying David. Last year's Thanksgiving had been the worst. Madison had seated me in the kitchen, to be closer to everything in case we needed help serving. I spent the entire dinner listening to my family laugh in the dining room while I ate alone at the breakfast counter, jumping up to refill water glasses whenever Madison called. "Ellen's so helpful," Madison had announced loudly when her mother complimented the meal I had actually cooked. "She just loves feeling useful. Don't you, Ellen?" I had smiled and agreed as always, but that night I went home and updated my will. David would inherit what I wanted him to inherit, but the bulk of my estate would go to causes that actually mattered to me. Madison would never see a penny of money she had spent 15 years assuming would eventually be hers to control. Now, walking through my $19 million mansion, I realized the time for secret keeping was over. Madison's phone call this morning had been the final straw, the last insult I was willing to absorb for the sake of family peace. She thought she could commandeer my home because she saw me as powerless, as someone who would always give in rather than cause conflict, as Herbert's relict who should be grateful for whatever attention her successful daughter-in-law was willing to spare. She was about to learn how wrong she had been. I walked back to the safe in my closet and pulled out my phone book. Not the one David and Madison knew about, with numbers for my bridge club and the local grocery store. The other one, with contacts I had built over decades of careful investing and strategic networking. My first call was to James Morrison, the property manager who had helped me purchase this house. James? Ellen Whitmore. I need to discuss some arrangements for next weekend. I'm having family visit, and I want everything to be perfect. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. What can we arrange for you? I smiled, looking out at my ocean view. Well, I think it's time my family learned exactly what kind of woman they've been underestimating all these years. The conversation took 20 minutes. When I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in years. Madison wanted to use my house? She could have it. She wanted to bring her whole entitled family to my private sanctuary? They were all welcome. But this time they were going to meet the real Ellen Whitmore. Not the quiet widow who smiled and served and stayed in the background. Not the grateful mother-in-law who accepted whatever scraps of inclusion they threw her way. They were going to meet the woman who had turned grocery money into a fortune. The woman who owned 3 properties they didn't know about. The woman who had been playing chess while they thought she was playing checkers. And Madison, who had spent 15 years treating me like the help, was about to discover that she had been insulting someone who could have bought and sold her husband's entire company without checking her bank balance first. I made 3 more calls that afternoon. By evening, everything was in motion. Friday couldn't come fast enough. Friday morning arrived with perfect California sunshine, and I stood in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, orchestrating what I privately called my masterpiece. The house buzzed with activity, but not the frantic kind Madison had expected me to provide. This was something entirely different. Mrs. Whitmore, the caterers have arrived, announced Maria, the property manager I had hired specifically for this weekend. She was a consummate professional who had managed events for tech billionaires and Hollywood executives. Madison had no idea what she was walking into. Excellent. And the photographer. Setting up in the East Wing as requested. The flowers from the Beverly Hills florist should arrive within the hour. I nodded, sipping my coffee from bone china that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Everything had to be perfect. Not for Madison's comfort, but for my revelation. The doorbell chimed, and I heard James's voice greeting someone in the foyer. My personal banker arriving right on schedule. I had invited Richard Pemberton for what I told him would be a casual family gathering, but Richard knew better. He had managed my investments for 15 years and understood exactly why I might want certain documents present during this particular weekend. Ellen, Richard kissed my cheek in greeting, his silver hair impeccably styled as always. I brought everything you requested. The portfolio summaries, property deeds, and investment statements. Though I must say, I'm curious about this sudden desire to share your financial details with family. Let's just say it's time for some overdue transparency, I replied, accepting the leather folder he handed me. I've spent too many years letting people make assumptions. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched as a team of landscapers put finishing touches on the gardens I had already paid to maintain. The pool sparkled like a jewel, heated exactly as Madison had demanded. Though she had no idea the monthly heating bill for this pool exceeded most people's mortgage payments. My phone rang and I glanced at the caller ID. David. Hi, honey, I answered, keeping my voice neutral. Mom, we're about 2 hours out. I just wanted to make sure everything was ready. Madison's been pretty stressed about the arrangements, and you know how she gets when things aren't perfect. I did know. Madison's version of perfect usually involved me scrambling to meet impossible standards, while she took credit for the results. But today would be different. Everything is under control, David. I think Madison will be very surprised by the arrangements. That's great, Mom. I really appreciate you doing this. I know the house is important to you, but family comes first, right? The irony wasn't lost on me. David talking about family, while calling to ensure his mother had properly prepared her own home for his wife's convenience. When had he last asked how I was doing? When had he last visited just to see me, rather than when Madison needed something? Family is very important, I agreed. That's exactly why I've planned something special. After hanging up, I walked through the house one more time, checking details. The staff I had hired for the weekend moved efficiently through their tasks, but they weren't the typical house cleaners Madison might expect. These were professionals who regularly worked celebrity events and corporate retreats. They understood discretion, excellence, and most importantly, they understood that Ellen Whitmore was the person who signed their paychecks. In the main living room, I had arranged several items on the coffee table that looked casual but were anything but random. A copy of Forbes magazine featuring an article about women investors. A Sotheby's catalog from a recent art auction where I had purchased 3 pieces. A business card from my wealth management firm, carelessly placed as if I had just received it in the mail. The guest bedrooms were prepared with luxury linens that cost more per set than Madison spent on her monthly clothing budget. Fresh orchids graced every room, flown in from Hawaii that morning. The refrigerator was stocked with organic produce and gourmet items from specialty stores Madison probably didn't even know existed. But the real preparations were less visible. In my study, I had arranged my personal financial documents in neat stacks, as if I had been reviewing them recently. Bank statements showing 8-figure balances. Investment reports tracking my portfolio's performance. Property deeds for the 3 homes I owned that my family didn't know about. I had also made some strategic phone calls. Margaret, it's Ellen Whitmore. I wanted to confirm our lunch appointment for Monday. The one where we're discussing the Museum Foundation Board position. Margaret Hensley ran the most prestigious cultural foundation in the state. We had served on committees together for years, though Madison had no idea her supposedly simple mother-in-law moved in such circles. Of course, Ellen. I'm so pleased you're considering the position. Your expertise in arts funding would be invaluable, and honestly, your donation last year made our gala the most successful in the foundation's history. Wonderful. I may have some family visiting this weekend, so if anyone asks, please feel free to mention our upcoming meeting. Similar calls went to the president of the environmental charity where I served on the board, the dean of the university where I had funded a scholarship program, and the director of the children's hospital where my donations had built an entire wing. By noon, my house had been transformed into something that looked effortlessly elegant rather than desperately prepared. The staff had retreated to discreet positions where they could assist without hovering. The catered lunch was laid out as if I had somehow prepared gourmet meals for 12 people single-handedly. I changed into a silk dress that had cost more than Madison's car payment, paired with jewelry I rarely wore because it seemed too flashy for the role of humble widow I had been playing. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. For years, I had dressed to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about where I got my money. Today, I dressed like the successful woman I actually was. At 2:30, I heard car doors slamming in the circular driveway. Through the window, I watched Madison emerge from David's BMW, already surveying the property with the calculating eyes of someone taking inventory of what she considered temporarily hers. She wore white jeans and a designer top, her highlighted hair perfectly styled, her posture screaming entitlement. Behind her came David, looking tired and slightly overwhelmed, the way he always did when Madison was in full planning mode. 2 teenagers, my grandchildren Brandon and Ashley, clambered out looking bored and glued to their phones. A second car pulled up, disgorging Madison's parents, Harold and Beverly, and her sister Nicole with her twin boys. A third car followed with people I didn't recognize but assumed were the colleagues Madison had mentioned. I watched from behind the curtain as Madison gestured expansively at the house, clearly explaining to her entourage how she had arranged this perfect vacation rental. How generous she was being by including everyone. How wonderful it was that Ellen had been so accommodating about stepping aside for 2 weeks. The front door opened and Maria stepped out to greet them. "Good afternoon, you must be Mrs. Patterson," she said to Madison, using the formal tone reserved for distinguished guests. "Mrs. Whitmore is expecting you." I saw Madison's eyebrows rise slightly at being addressed so formally by obvious staff, but she quickly recovered and swept toward the entrance like a queen claiming her palace. "Ellen!" Madison's voice rang through the foyer as I descended the main staircase. "This place is absolutely gorgeous. Even better than the photos online. You've really outdone yourself with the preparations." She air-kissed me in greeting, a gesture she had never made before, but I suppose she was performing for her audience. Behind her, Harold nodded politely, while Beverly examined the chandelier with obvious calculation. Nicole was already taking selfies against the marble backdrop. "Welcome to my home," I said simply, emphasis just subtle enough that only I noticed it. David hugged me properly, and for a moment my resolve wavered. He was still my son, still the little boy who used to help me bake cookies and tell me about his day at school. But then I caught Madison's eye as she surveyed the living room, mentally rearranging the furniture to better suit her needs, and my determination solidified. "Mom, this place is incredible," David said, looking around in wonder. "I had no idea you were thinking about something this elaborate when you mentioned downsizing." Downsizing. That was what I had told them when I sold the family home after Herbert's death. They assumed I had moved somewhere smaller, cheaper, more appropriate for an elderly widow on a fixed income. "I wanted something special," I replied. "Something that reflected who I really am." Madison was already directing her family toward the guest bedrooms, assigning rooms with the efficiency of a hotel manager. "Ellen will need fresh towels in all the bathrooms, and could you check that there are enough hangers in the closets? Oh, and the boys will need access to the kitchen after hours. You know how teenage boys eat." She spoke to me the way she always did, like a supervisor instructing an employee. But this time her parents and sister and friends were watching. This time witnesses were present to see exactly how Madison Whitmore treated her husband's mother in her own home. "Of course," I said pleasantly. "Maria will take care of anything you need. She's here specifically to ensure your comfort." "Maria?" Madison looked confused for a moment, as if she couldn't understand why I would hire help for what she considered my duties. "My house manager," I explained. "I find it makes entertaining so much more pleasant when one doesn't have to worry about the details." The confusion in Madison's eyes deepened, but before she could ask more questions, Richard Pemberton appeared in the doorway, perfectly on cue. "Ellen, I'm sorry to interrupt," he said with professional courtesy, "but I wanted to confirm our appointment for Monday morning to review the quarterly reports." Madison's head snapped around. "Reports?" Richard smiled politely at her, then looked back at me. "The portfolio performance has been exceptional this quarter. Your technology investments alone have increased in value by 12%. I felt rather than saw Madison's sharp attention focus on this conversation, but I simply nodded. "Wonderful news, Richard. We can discuss the details Monday." As Richard excused himself, promising to call later, I caught sight of Madison's face. The confusion was giving way to something sharper, more calculating. For the first time since she had arrived, she was looking at me, really looking at me instead of through me. The weekend was off to a perfect start. Saturday morning brought the first crack in Madison's composed facade. I was in the kitchen at 7, not frantically preparing breakfast as she had expected, but sitting at the marble island reading the Wall Street Journal while Maria arranged fresh fruit and pastries from the French bakery I patronized. Madison appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe, her hair still perfect despite having just woken up. She looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the professional-grade appliances, the wine refrigerator stocked with bottles worth more than her monthly mortgage payment, the fresh orchids that had replaced themselves overnight. "Ellen," she said carefully, "I wanted to thank you for all this. It's really quite elaborate." I looked up from an article about emerging markets, smiling pleasantly. "I'm glad you're comfortable. Coffee? Maria makes excellent espresso. Actually, I was wondering if we could talk privately." I folded the newspaper and gestured toward the sunroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, dotted with sailboats that looked like toys from this distance. Madison settled into one of the leather chairs I had imported from Italy, her movements uncharacteristically tentative. "Ellen, I feel like there might be some things about your situation that David and I don't fully understand." "My situation?" Madison's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the chair arm. "Well, this house, for instance. The staff. That man yesterday talking about portfolios and quarterly reports. I'm just wondering if maybe we should discuss your finances more openly." There it was. The conversation I had been waiting 15 years to have. Madison, who had treated me like a poor relation for over a decade, was finally asking about money. Not because she cared about my well-being, but because she was beginning to suspect she had miscalculated something important. "What would you like to know?" "I suppose I'm curious about how you afforded all this. David mentioned you had some savings from Herbert's life insurance, but this seems like more than that would cover." I stood up and walked to the windows looking out at the view I owned. "Madison, has it ever occurred to you that you might not know me as well as you think you do?" Before she could answer, David appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day. "Morning, Mom. This place is incredible. I was just telling Brandon about the pool setup. He wants to bring some friends over later if that's okay." Madison shot me a look that I interpreted as a request to table our conversation, but I had no intention of accommodating her anymore. "Of course he can invite friends," I said, "though he should probably mention to them that this is a private residence, not a hotel." David laughed. "He knows that, Mom. We all really appreciate you letting us use the place like this." Use the place. As if I were lending them something that didn't belong to me. "David," I said carefully, "when you say use the place, you do understand this is my home, don't you? Not a rental property or vacation house that I'm borrowing." Something shifted in his expression. "Well, yes, of course. I just meant, it's so grand, so different from what you had before." What I had before. The modest house where I had lived as Herbert's wife, playing the role of simple homemaker while secretly building an empire they knew nothing about. People change, David. Sometimes they reveal aspects of themselves that have been there all along. Madison was watching this exchange with growing alarm, and I could practically see her mind racing. Harold and Beverly chose that moment to join us, drawn by the smell of fresh pastries and the promise of ocean views. "Ellen, dear," Beverly said, settling herself into the chair with the best view. "This is simply magnificent. You must tell us how you managed to find such a perfect place." "I didn't find it," I replied. "I bought it." The distinction seemed to escape Beverly, but Madison caught it immediately. Her eyes narrowed as she processed the implications of my word choice. Harold was examining the built-in bar, running his fingers over the marble countertop. "Must have cost a pretty penny. These oceanfront properties are going for what, 10 million? 15? 19, I said simply. The silence that followed was profound. Harold's hand froze on the marble. Beverly's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. David looked from me to Madison as if trying to solve a puzzle. 19 million? David's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the shock underneath. I nodded. The location was worth the premium. Madison found her voice first. "Ellen, I think there might be some confusion here. Are you saying you personally purchased this house? For $19 million? Is that so hard to believe?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I watched as Madison's mind worked through the implications, recalculating everything she thought she knew about her mother-in-law's financial situation. "But where would you get that kind of money?" David asked bluntly. For 49 years I had been waiting for someone in my family to ask that question. To show enough interest in me as a person to wonder about my capabilities, my intelligence, my life beyond the roles they had assigned me. "I earned it," I said. Before anyone could respond, my phone rang. Margaret Hensley's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a smile. "Margaret, good morning. Yes, I'm still planning to attend the Museum Foundation Gala next month. Should I bring the same guest I brought last year? Or would you prefer I come alone?" I could feel 4 pairs of eyes staring at me as I continued the conversation, discussing seating arrangements for an event that cost $5,000 per plate, mentioning casually that my donation for the silent auction had already been delivered. When I hung up, the silence was even more pronounced than before. "Museum Foundation?" Beverly asked weakly. "I serve on the board," I explained. "We're funding a new wing for contemporary art." David sat down heavily in one of the chairs, looking like someone who had just discovered his quiet suburban neighbor was actually a celebrity. "Mom, I don't understand. How long have you been involved in things like this?" "Things like what?" "Charity boards. Investment portfolios. $19 million real estate purchases." I could have been gentle. I could have eased them into the truth gradually, let them save face while they adjusted to this new reality. But I thought about all the times Madison had dismissed me, excluded me, treated me like an inconvenience. All the times David had patted my shoulder and assured me he would take care of everything, because he assumed I couldn't handle my own affairs. "Since before you were born, David." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread across all their faces. Madison was the first to recover. "That's impossible. Herbert worked as an accountant. You were a housewife. I was a wife and mother who also happened to be very good with investments. But Dad never mentioned. Your father never knew." Another silence, this one charged with electricity. I could see Madison's mind working furiously, trying to reconcile 15 years of assumptions with this new information. "You're telling us," David said slowly, "that you've been secretly wealthy our entire lives?" "Not our entire lives. Took time to build. But yes, I've been financially independent for longer than you might imagine." Harold cleared his throat. "Ellen, this is quite a revelation. Why keep it secret?" It was a fair question, and I considered how to answer it. The truth was complicated, layered with decades of small compromises and quiet disappointments. Initially, I kept quiet because Herbert wouldn't have approved. He had very specific ideas about women and money. Later, I realized that people treated me differently when they thought I was just a simple widow. They were more honest, more revealing about their true characters. Madison's face had gone pale. "What does that mean?" "It means, Madison, that for 15 years I've watched how you treat someone you think has no power. Someone you believe is dependent on your generosity and goodwill." The accusation hung between us, stark and undeniable. Madison's mouth opened, then closed, as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't confirm exactly what I had said. David looked stricken. "Mom, if you felt that we were treating you badly, why didn't you say something?" "When would I have said something, David? Between the holidays when I was cooking dinner but not invited to eat with the family? During the birthdays when I was forgotten until the last minute? Or perhaps during the conversations where you assured me you would handle my finances because they were too complicated for me to understand?" Each word hit its mark. I could see the memories playing across David's face, moments he had probably forgotten, but that had carved deep wounds in my heart. Madison stood abruptly. "I think I need some air." She walked out onto the terrace, and after a moment David followed her. Through the glass I could see them having an intense conversation, Madison gesturing wildly while David ran his hands through his hair. Harold and Beverly sat in uncomfortable silence, staring into their coffee cups as if they could find answers there. "I suppose," Beverly finally said, "we owe you an apology, Ellen." "For what?" "For assuming. For not asking more questions about your life." It wasn't much of an apology, but it was more than Madison had ever offered. Outside, Madison's voice was rising, though I couldn't make out the words. David kept glancing back at the house, at me, as if trying to reconcile his memories of his simple mother with the woman sitting calmly in her $19 million home. When they came back inside, Madison's composure had cracked. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Ellen," she said, her voice tight, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about this weekend." "What kind of misunderstanding?" We thought, this was your way of sharing, of including family in your good fortune." I set down my coffee cup very carefully. "Madison, you called me and informed me that you were taking over my home for 2 weeks. You told me to prepare the house and find somewhere else to stay. At what point in that conversation did you get the impression I was inviting you to share anything?" The words hit their target. Madison's face flushed, and she looked to David for support, but he was staring at the floor. I think," I continued, "it might be time for some honesty about what this weekend really is." Madison's face had gone through several shades of red, finally settling on a color that reminded me of the roses in my garden, beautiful from a distance but sharp with thorns up close. She gripped the back of the leather chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Honesty?" she repeated, her voice climbing an octave. "You want to talk about honesty, Ellen? How about the honesty of telling your own son that you're wealthy enough to buy oceanfront mansions? How about the honesty of not pretending to be some helpless widow when you're apparently sitting on a fortune?" David stepped closer to his wife, placing a warning hand on her arm, but Madison shook him off. 15 years of careful social masks were crumbling, and the real Madison was emerging like a snake shedding its skin. "You let us worry about you," she continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You let David stress about whether you had enough money for groceries, for utilities, for medical bills. You sat there at family dinners looking so grateful for our help, so appreciative when we included you in anything, and the whole time you were richer than all of us combined." I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching this display with the detached fascination of an anthropologist observing an interesting specimen. "When did you help me with groceries, Madison?" The question stopped her mid-rant. What? You mentioned that David worried about whether I could afford groceries. When did either of you ever help me buy groceries? Madison's mouth opened, then closed. David shifted uncomfortably. We offered, David said weakly. When? Another silence. Harold and Beverly had retreated as far into their chairs as physics would allow, clearly wishing they could disappear entirely. Outside, I could hear the voices of the grandchildren and their friends around the pool, blissfully unaware of the family drama unfolding inside. The point is, Madison said, recovering her momentum, you deceived us. You let us make assumptions and you never corrected them. That's lying by omission. Is it? My calm response seemed to infuriate her further. Of course it is. We're family, Ellen. Family doesn't keep secrets like this. Family. I repeated the word slowly, tasting its bitter irony. Tell me, Madison, when have you ever treated me like family? That's ridiculous. Of course I've treated you like family. I stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the perfect blue ocean that stretched to the horizon. Behind me, I could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Last Thanksgiving, I said without turning around, you seated me in the kitchen while everyone else ate in the dining room. You told your mother I preferred to eat alone because I got overwhelmed by too much conversation. That's not. Christmas 2 years ago. You canceled our dinner plans because your yoga instructor had an unexpected opening. You texted me at 4 in the afternoon to let me know not to come. Ellen, you're taking things out of context. David's 40th birthday party. Now I turned to face her. You forgot to invite me until the night before, then asked if I could bring dessert for 30 people. When I arrived, you introduced me to your friends as David's mother who helps with the catering. Each memory I recited hit like a physical blow. Madison's face was cycling through expressions, denial, anger, something that might have been shame if she were capable of it. David looked sick. Mom, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, David, because you weren't paying attention. Because it was easier to let Madison handle family relationships while you focused on work. That's not fair, Madison snapped. I've always tried to include you. Include me. My voice remained steady, but something cold and sharp had crept into it. Madison, you've spent 15 years trying to erase me. Every family gathering becomes your show, with me cast as the help. Every tradition I started gets replaced with something you prefer. Every conversation I try to join gets redirected to topics that exclude me. You're being dramatic. Am I? Harold, Beverly, you've been watching this family dynamic for 15 years. Have you ever seen Madison treat me as an equal? As David's mother who deserves respect in her own right? Harold and Beverly exchanged uncomfortable glances. Beverly cleared her throat delicately. Well, families have different dynamics. That's not an answer, I said firmly. That's a polite way of saying you've watched your daughter treat me like hired help and never said anything about it. Beverly flushed, but Harold found his voice. Ellen, if you felt disrespected, perhaps you should have spoken up earlier. The victim blaming was so perfectly predictable that I almost smiled. You're right, Harold. I should have spoken up earlier. I should have established boundaries from the beginning. I should have made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate being treated like a convenient servant in my own family. Madison was breathing hard. Her perfect composure completely shattered. This is insane. You're rewriting history to make yourself look like some kind of victim. I don't need to rewrite anything, Madison. The history speaks for itself. I walked to my study and returned with a small photo album I had prepared for this moment. I set it on the coffee table and opened it to the first page. David's college graduation, I said, pointing to a photo of my son in his cap and gown. I'm not in this picture because Madison told me the photographer was only taking immediate family photos. I turned the page. Ashley's baptism. I'm not in any of these photos because Madison decided I was too old to stand with the family for the formal portraits. Another page. Brandon's high school graduation party. I'm serving food in every picture where I appear because Madison asked me to help with hosting duties while she posed with the family. With each photo, each memory, Madison's face grew paler. David looked like he might be sick. Stop, Madison whispered. Why? Are these memories uncomfortable for you? You're twisting everything. You're making me sound like some kind of monster. I'm not making you sound like anything, Madison. I'm simply showing you a record of how you've chosen to treat me for 15 years. David finally found his voice. Mom, why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you tell me how you felt? The question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and watched grow into someone who had inherited his father's blindness about women's worth. Because you wouldn't have believed me, David. Because Madison is your wife, and she's beautiful and charming and she makes you happy. Because it would have been my word against hers, and she had something I didn't. What's that? Your attention. The words hung in the air like a judgment. David's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. When was the last time you visited me just to see how I was doing? Not because Madison needed something, not because there was a family obligation, but just because you wanted to spend time with your mother. He couldn't answer. We both knew he couldn't answer. Madison was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration. The tears of someone who had been exposed and didn't like what the light revealed. This is all because of money, she said, her voice thick with tears. You're punishing us because we didn't know you were rich. You're holding our assumptions against us like we're criminals for not being mind readers. No, Madison. I'm holding your behavior against you. The money is irrelevant to how you've treated me. Whether I had millions or pennies, I deserved basic respect as David's mother. I deserved to be included in family gatherings without having to serve the meal. I deserved to have my contributions acknowledged instead of being dismissed, as the helpful old woman who just loves feeling useful. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her perfect makeup. So what now? You've made your point. You've humiliated me in front of my parents and shown everyone what a terrible person I am. What happens now? It was the first question she had asked that mattered. What happened now? I had spent so many years imagining this moment, planning for the day when the truth would finally come out, but I had never really thought beyond the revelation. Looking at my son's stricken face, at Madison's tears, at Harold and Beverly's uncomfortable silence, I realized something important. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destroy relationships or tear apart my family. I just wanted to be seen. To be acknowledged, to be treated like a person who mattered. What happens now, I said carefully, depends on what you want to happen. Madison looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean that I'm done being invisible. I'm done accepting crumbs of inclusion and pretending they're feast. I'm done letting people make assumptions about my capabilities or my worth. But I'm not interested in destroying anyone. I paused, looking at each face in turn. I'm interested in having real relationships with people who see me as I actually am. Not as a convenient helper or a problem to be managed, but as Ellen Whitmore. A woman who has built something meaningful with her life and deserves to be respected for it. David was nodding slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. What would that look like? He asked quietly. It would look like honesty, I replied. It would look like being included in family decisions instead of being informed about them after the fact. It would look like acknowledgement of who I am, and what I've accomplished, not just what role you need me to fill. Madison was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes held something I had never seen before, uncertainty. I don't know how to do that, she admitted quietly. For the first time in 15 years, Madison had said something I believed completely. She really didn't know how to treat me as an equal because she had never seen me as one. Then maybe, I said gently, it's time to learn. 6 months later, I stood on the same terrace where this story began, but everything had changed. The ocean was the same brilliant blue. The waves crashed against the shore with the same eternal rhythm, but the woman watching them was fundamentally different. I was no longer hiding. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. After that weekend in March, when Madison and David and the whole family had learned the truth about Ellen Whitmore, there had been difficult conversations, hurt feelings, and a painful period of adjustment for everyone involved. Madison had left that Sunday afternoon in tears, not the manipulative tears she usually deployed, but genuine ones born of having to confront 15 years of behavior she could no longer pretend was acceptable. She and David had driven away in silence, the grandchildren confused about why the vacation had ended so abruptly, The extended family awkwardly making excuses to leave early. For 2 weeks I heard nothing. No calls, no texts, no demands for my time or attention. The silence was both liberating and heartbreaking. I had gained my voice but feared I had lost my family. Then David came alone. He sat in the same chair where Madison had confronted me, looking older than his 42 years, his face etched with exhaustion and something that might have been understanding. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began without preamble. "About the last time I visited just to see you." I waited, saying nothing. "I can't remember, Mom. I've been trying for 2 weeks to remember a single time in the past 5 years when I came to see you just because I wanted to spend time with my mother, and I can't remember one." The admission hung between us like a bridge. I wasn't sure either of us was ready to cross. "I've been a terrible son," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I let Madison manage our relationship with you because it was easier than paying attention myself. I let her make decisions about family gatherings, about how you were included or excluded, because I trusted her to handle the details while I focused on work." "David." "No, let me finish. I need to say this." He took a shaky breath. "I realize that I don't actually know you at all. I know my mother who used to pack my lunches and help with homework, but I don't know Ellen Whitmore, the woman who built a fortune while raising me. I don't know what you like to do for fun, what books you read, what causes matter to you. I've been treating you like a supporting character in my life, instead of recognizing that you have a full life of your own." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. This was what I had hoped for, dreamed of, but hadn't dared to expect. "I want to change that," David said. "I want to know my mother. The real one. Not the version Madison and I created in our heads to make ourselves comfortable." That conversation lasted 4 hours. We talked about my investments, my charity work, my passion for art collecting that he had never known existed. I told him about the scholarship fund I had established in his grandfather's name, about the hospital wing I had funded, about the environmental foundation where I served on the board. With each revelation, David looked more amazed and more ashamed. "How could I not know any of this?" "Because I didn't want you to know. I was afraid that if you knew I was wealthy, it would change how you saw me, how you related to me. I was afraid you would either treat me differently or expect things from me that I wasn't ready to give." "And Madison?" I chose my words carefully. "Madison saw what she expected to see, a simple widow who should be grateful for whatever attention she was given. It was easier for both of us to let her continue believing that than to deal with the complications of the truth." David was quiet for a long time. "She's devastated, you know. She keeps saying she doesn't understand how she became the villain in this story." "She's not a villain, David. She's a woman who learned to see me a certain way and never questioned those assumptions. But the fact that she's devastated suggests she does understand, at least partially. What would it take for you to forgive her?" The question I had been asking myself for weeks. "I don't need her to grovel or punish herself. I just need her to see me. Really see me, not as an extension of you or as help she can command, but as a person with my own thoughts, feelings, and value. Can you teach us how to do that?" The simple humility of the question broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. 3 months later, Madison came to see me. Alone. She looked different, smaller somehow, less armored. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of her usual perfect styling, and she wore jeans and a sweater that looked comfortable rather than designer. "Ellen," she said, standing awkwardly in my foyer, "I was wondering if we could try again." "Try what again?" "Getting to know each other. Actually getting to know each other, not just playing the roles we've been stuck in." I invited her to sit, but this time I didn't serve her. We sat as equals in my living room. 2 women trying to figure out how to build a relationship on honesty instead of assumptions. "I've been in therapy," Madison said without preamble, "trying to understand why I treated you the way I did. Why I never questioned my own behavior, or wondered what kind of person you really were." "What did you learn?" Madison's hands twisted in her lap. "That I was threatened by you. That sounds crazy, I know, because I thought you were just this quiet old woman who didn't have much going on. But somewhere deep down, I knew David loved you in a way that had nothing to do with me, and I couldn't stand not being the most important woman in his life." The honesty was startling, more than I had expected from Madison. "So I diminished you," she continued. "I made you smaller in every interaction. reduced you to someone who existed to serve my needs, because that made you less threatening. If you were just the helpful mother-in-law who was grateful for inclusion, then I didn't have to compete with the woman who raised the man I married. I had never thought of our dynamic in those terms, but there was truth in what she said. And when you showed me who you really were, Madison's voice grew quieter. When I realized that you were accomplished and sophisticated and wealthy and strong, I felt like an idiot. Not just because I had misjudged you, but because I had revealed so much about my own insecurity and pettiness. We talked for 3 hours that day. Madison asked questions about my life, my interests, my work with various charities. She listened, really listened. When I told her about my passion for supporting women's education and my quiet involvement in environmental causes. I had no idea you were funding scholarships for women returning to school, she said at one point. That's incredible work. Most people don't know. I prefer to give quietly. Why? Because the work matters more than the recognition. And because I learned long ago that when people know you have money, it changes how they see you. Sometimes not in ways you want. Madison nodded slowly. I can understand that now. By the time she left that afternoon, something had shifted between us. Not friendship exactly, but the possibility of respect. Now, 6 months after the weekend that changed everything, I can honestly say that my relationships with my family have been rebuilt on a foundation of truth instead of convenient fiction. David visits regularly, not because Madison sends him or because he feels obligated, but because he genuinely enjoys spending time with his mother. He's curious about my business investments and asks thoughtful questions about my charity work. For his birthday, instead of buying him something, I invited him to join me on the board of the Scholarship Foundation. He accepted eagerly. Madison and I will probably never be best friends, but we've found a way to be genuine with each other. She includes me in family plans by asking what I would enjoy, rather than telling me what role I'm expected to play. When she disagrees with me, she says so directly instead of using passive-aggressive manipulation. It's a relief for both of us to stop pretending. The grandchildren, Brandon and Ashley, have been the easiest to win over. They're fascinated by their grandmother's secret life, as they call it, and Ashley has started talking about following in my footsteps as an investor. I've been teaching her to read financial statements, just like my father taught me 70 years ago. But the most important change is in how I see myself. For decades, I allowed other people's expectations to define my boundaries. I made myself smaller to make others comfortable, kept my accomplishments secret to avoid complicating relationships, and accepted poor treatment because it seemed easier than fighting for respect. That version of Ellen Whitmore no longer exists. I wear my success openly now. Not arrogantly, but without apology. I serve on boards where my voice carries weight. I make donations that matter. I speak up when I disagree with something instead of swallowing my opinions to keep peace. And I've learned something important about family dynamics. Respect isn't automatically given based on biology or marriage. It has to be earned and maintained through genuine care and consideration. Last week, Madison called to ask if I would like to co-host Thanksgiving this year. Not host while she took credit, not provide food while she played hostess, but truly co-host as equals. I was thinking we could do it here, she said, referring to my house, but only if you want to. And we would plan the menu together, share the cooking, make decisions together about everything. The invitation was extended with a respect that would have been impossible 6 months ago. I would like that, I told her. I would like that very much. This morning, as I sat on my terrace drinking coffee and reading the business section of the newspaper, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. Hi, Mom, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I was just calling to see how you are. No agenda, no requests, just wanted to hear your voice. I'm wonderful, sweetheart. How are you? I'm good. Really good. And Mom? Thank you. For what? For not giving up on us. For showing us who you really are even though it was scary and difficult. For teaching us how to be a real family instead of just people who share DNA. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a while, watching the ocean and thinking about the journey that brought me to this moment. The path from silent suffering to honest self-advocacy hadn't been smooth or easy, but it had been worth every uncomfortable conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every fear that I might lose the people I loved most. I hadn't lost them. I had found them and they had found me. For the first time in my 77 years, Ellen Whitmore was exactly who she wanted to be. Surrounded by people who saw her clearly and loved her authentically. The ocean stretched endlessly before me. Full of possibilities I was finally free to explore.